Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ravlick. Thank you so much for joining me for this particular podcast. Those of you who've followed the series of podcasts would know that I've spoken to a few interesting candidates, some independents and others who were standing in the election this year and running for federal parliament. My guest today is no less interesting. She is Celeste Liddle. She's running for the Greens. She's a writer. She's been an activist. She's a unionist. She's got a whole heap of stuff she's done. I'll get her to explain that in a second. She's also standing for the seat of Cooper, which is sort of in a suburban Melbourne type seat. She will explain all of that to us in a moment. We'll explore a bunch of stuff and no doubt explore some issues to do with First Nations as well. Celeste, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom.
It'll be great to hear what you've got to say. Now, before we get on to issues of substance and why you're running for the election, etc., there will be those people who either don't know you at all or only know you from your social media presence, which can be somewhat colourful at times. They won't know you as a person. So, how would you describe your career in the first instance to somebody as if it was written on an envelope? What are the key milestones for you?
Yeah, no worries. Well, before I begin I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm sitting here on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and paying my respects to their elders past and present. The first thing that I would tell people about myself is that I'm an Aranda woman. So my traditional lands are Mbantua or Alice Springs, and then east and southeast of there. So I'm a traditional landowner from Central Australia, but I was born in Canberra, and I've lived in Melbourne now for 30 years, 30 years this January, actually. My career is mixed. So for the last 11 years, I've been an organiser with the National Tertiary Education Union. Prior to working as a union organiser, National Indigenous organiser specifically, prior to working in the union movement, I actually worked in the higher education sector. So I worked in Indigenous student support and recruitment, assisting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students to get into uni and succeed in their studies through uni. I worked first at Victorian College of the Arts and then at Melbourne University proper. So what else about me? I'm a writer and social commentator. So most recently, up until I was pre-selected, I had a column with Eureka Street, but I've also had columns with Fairfax back in the day when they had Daily Life, and with The Guardian. And I've written for a number of other publications like ABC, SBS, News Limited, so many now. I've actually lost track. So I'm a writer and social commentator, and I have been for well over a decade, ever since I started my blog about 10 years ago called Rantings of an Aboriginal Feminist, which got noticed by the media. And so I ended up writing within the media. So general activist, huge fan of the live music scene in Melbourne, multiple university graduate. So I've now graduated from La Trobe, Melbourne Uni and Monash. So I'm a repeat student. And yeah, that's probably me in a nutshell.
And there's a lot. There's a lot you've done. There's a lot we could dive into. But I guess part of the purpose of having a chat here is the federal election. And what fascinated me, and the reason I wanted to chat to you, was the choice you've made to stand for the Greens, particularly in the place you've been. Can you give us a background? What motivated you to stand for an election? Because it's one thing to write columns and then comment and poke people on social media, which is all good fun. But standing for election means you're prepared to serve. There's a degree of greater gravity to it. How did you get to that decision?
And this is a little bit of a long story, Tom. So if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'll try and make it as condensed as I can.
Yeah.
But as you said, I've been engaged in the public sphere, in the political sphere, for a really long time, and I've repeatedly said, and a lot of people know this, that there is no way in the world that I would consider ever running for politics. But something did change, and I think that the two key things that I would say changed my mind were COVID and the series of lockdowns, and seeing community disparities get bigger and bigger, and wanting, and the penny dropping for me, I guess, with regards to realising that there are a handful of people in this society who make decisions that impact the lives of millions. And the decisions that they make were impacting the lives of millions. So I decided that, putting my name in the mix from that perspective was important. The other big driver for me was that I have lived in this seat in Cooper, which was known as Batman, and they got renamed after an incredible Yorta man, William Cooper. I can talk about him a little bit in a bit, but, since 1997, with a small break of a couple of years in the middle of that. And in the entire time that I've been in this seat, and indeed the entire time that this, well, not the entire time, since the 1930s, bar a couple of years, this seat has been held by the Labor Party. It used to be the safest seat in the country, Labor or Liberal. And until about a decade ago, that remained the case. But the Greens started chipping away at that, and they turned this safest Labor seat in the country to a marginal seat. And we saw that go backwards in the 2018 election. And I strongly believe that, being that this is, this is the seat in the country which records the highest percentage of progressive vote. So there, for the purposes of democracy, there's a real need for there to be as much progressive choice in this seat as is possible, because that's who our constituents in this seat are. That they're progressive people. They deserve the same right to democratic choice as what anyone in any other seat in this country does. But the choice here isn't between Labor and Liberal. It's between, which progressive best represents your values. And so given that the Greens vote went backwards at the last election, because we did finally, after years of having incredibly ordinary Labor candidates in this seat, holding this seat, because it was taken for granted by the Labor Party, we did get Jed Carney put up as the Labor candidate. And because of that, the Greens vote went backwards. And so I decided to stand in order to try and, firstly, to give people more of a choice in this seat, but also to try and help this seat become a more marginal seat again, so that the voices in this seat are no longer neglected. I feel that safe seats lead to neglect. The safer the seat, the more that the governments are likely to neglect the voices within it. And that's been the case for such a long time here.
There's a couple of interesting things that you bring to the table. One of which is the fact that you've worked in a setting, not just helping First Nations students go through university, but in a setting where you've looked at the disadvantage you've looked that people face in the academic sector and whatever else. How great a motivation did what you were observing in the education sector play in making that decision? Because while I accept that your engagement is to keep the major parties, whichever one holds Cooper, on edge if you don't win yourself. There's more to Celeste Liddell's involvement in this than meets the eye.
Yes.
What are the things that, particularly if we can start with the education sector, that have given you cause for concern, and what are the things? And then from that, what would you hope to try and change if you made it into Parliament?
Yeah, it was like, as you said, Tom, this is a huge driver. Like my entire career, and indeed ever since I left high school, my in some way, shape or form, I've been engaged in the higher education sector, either as a student or as a worker or as someone who works for the people working within the sector as a unionist. And it's been a huge driver. Like when I first went to university in 1997, the Dawkins reforms had only been in for a few years. So, fee paying had only been back in for a few years. But when I went, we started seeing the attacks on student unionism. And then as I was working in the sector, we saw voluntary student unionism come in, which completely changed universities' environments from being a learning community into a corporate entity. That students, it was essentially they were trying their hardest to make universities from a learning environment into just a degree factory where people go in one end and come out the other with degrees. But the problem, the biggest problems facing the higher education sector have been a succession of funding cuts. So the coalition made numerous attacks on higher education. I think people will remember the $100,000 degree campaigns that were going on. So the fact that people could leave the sector if they wanted to go in and, say, study medicine or law with a student debt that equaled $100,000. That was in the mid-2000s. The work choices legislation of the Howard government was kind of tested on higher education before it was rolled out in other places with the HEWAs, the Higher Education Workplace Relations Reforms. So they were trying to force workers onto individual contracts before everyone else. This was in amongst the Howard government continually cutting funding. The problem was that when Labor got into government last time, they too made cuts to the sector. So when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister, $2.1 billion was cut from the higher education sector. And as a unionist at the time, as a union organiser at the time working in that, we had to make decisions based on the attacks that the sector was facing, because the more money that was cut from the sector, the more international students got used as cash cows to prop up the sector, and the more tenuous employment situations became within the sector. So at this point in history, during COVID, about 20% of people lost their jobs in higher education, which is devastating. Over 80% in some universities of the teaching load is currently being taught by casual academics or people on tenuous contracts. So there is absolutely, we're at a point where there's absolutely no career pathways for people who wish to work within the higher education sector. And when you see other countries in the world investing money in higher education, particularly in COVID, at a time when a lot of people might wish to retrain after, losing their jobs and wanting to seek out different career pathways, we've got governments that continually rip funding out of higher ed. So, yeah, as someone who wouldn't have gone, who couldn't afford to go to university, as an Aboriginal student from a working class background, I couldn't have afforded to go to university had I have not gotten an accommodation scholarship. The idea that less and less people like me would have the opportunity to go to universities, the more that funding is cut, was a key issue behind a lot of this for me.
Let me take this one step further.
Yep.
We know that there's in the context of higher ed and then broader society generally, things are tough across the board. What did you observe, whether it be while you were working as a student advisor and then later in the union, what did you observe in terms of the way in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were being treated when compared to others? There's a bit of a mixed question there, and I think that what I was really concerned about, so I just said that the more that funding is cut, the less likely people like me are to enter the sector. Okay. Universities have long been bastions for white privileged males. They uphold the Western canon. And people who come from more wealthy backgrounds are more likely to enter universities. Now, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people overall are more likely to come from lower SES backgrounds. That's a noted statistical fact. So our ability to go in and influence the sector and shift it, the more that funding is cut from the sector, the less likely that is to occur. And at this point in history, I think Indigenous students only make up about 1.3% of the student population. I think that's the same with Indigenous staff in the sector. Only about 1.3% of
the university sector. We're not even halfway to reaching population parity rates of participation in the sector, either as staff or students. So the more Aboriginal students and staff get into the sector, the more that we can influence things like, pedagogies, culturally inclusive environments, the safety nets that we put in place. Like the more that universities are forced to actually cater to these student and staff populations and change the ways that they work. And for me, being that Australia is the home, like nowhere else in the world is this the case, but Australia is the home of the longest continuing knowledge systems in the world. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge systems are the longest continuing knowledge systems in the world. And yet Australia has done everything it can to ignore those knowledge systems when in fact they should be front and centre within learning environments such as universities. So the more that we get Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and staff through the door, the more that happens, and the more that universities are forced to actually include the knowledge systems that are unique and I'd argue crucial to this country moving forward.
This is a good point at which to segue to something else.
Yep.
That there's an umbilical cord between how many Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander students and graduates there are, with the capacity of any entity that is then set up to be a voice to Parliament, to have an adequate staff of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sort of experts to be able to work within the structure, to do research and all that kind of thing. Is that something that you've reflected on as well, in terms of where do people come from if once you get a voice to Parliament set up? Who serves it? Who works within it? Who does that work from within community?
Well, and I will say, Tom, that one of the as an Aboriginal person, and I this is probably something that I should have addressed at the beginning of our chat, but as an Aboriginal person deciding to run for the Greens, one of the biggest reasons why I did that was that the policies on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights that have been written up by Greens have been written up by Black Greens, which is, or the First Nations Greens Caucus. I'm using short terms, yeah, and very much what drew me to them, what was so attractive about the stand that the Black Greens have made, was that they're, from the Uluru Statement, they've taken a stance which aligns with my own, which is that rather than a voice first followed by a treaty and a truth-telling process, we need it the other way around. So the truth-telling process and the way that the higher education sector can contribute to that is through the research, through the changing, through teacher training, through the changing of education systems in order to incorporate Indigenous knowledges and proper Australian history and deal with what has been a massive whitewash in this country. We end up with a more educated society. Through the process of treaties, we end up with agreements and responsibilities between between the Australian government and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And therefore, the voice I see is needs to come out of the treaty process. So I feel that it should be negotiated through that process. I feel that any voice that ends up going to Parliament from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people needs to be one that has some legislative power, because we have had so many Aboriginal voices. Sorry, I did quotation marks for those who can't see me, but it needs to, we've had so many voices to Parliament before, whether it was Abbott's Indigenous Advisory Committee or the National Congress, that haven't had legislative power, and that needs to change. We need the right to have a say in the legislation that affects us as First Peoples. So that's number one. Number two is that it needs to be democratically elected from our communities. So I believe that the voice should be democratically elected from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in order to represent us. We need the right to be able to select who represents us. And those are the main things that I'd say. So the part that I see universities and education playing in that is absolutely huge, because we need people to be educated. We need the population to be knowledgeable and ready to then be able to deal with us having a proper seat at the table.
Well, one of the things that I find astounding, is that as a country, we're good at setting up authorities. We're good at setting up statutory bodies. We're good at appointing parliamentary committees, but we don't yet have something. We don't even have a body that you can plug and play to run a kind of a process in the interim. To be staffed by the people of the caliber of the Marshall Langtons of this world. That kind of person at the apex, and then you to have people who are of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background to be able to staff an entity to do the historical research, to do the policy planning, and to be able to the historical research to deal with what has been forgotten or never documented, to deal with the contemporary research, whether it be sort of the economic, social, and the political issues that people face within community. And then there's something else that needs to be able to be done, and that is to be able to turn things around quickly on consultation with government. Is there any value in establishing something, in your view, that deals with things in an interim period, while issues like constitution recognition, treaty, and any other elements are being considered and sort of being laid out?
Look, maybe. I mean, at the very least, it doesn't seem to matter what community or what group I talk, what Aboriginal groups across the country I talk to, Tom. Over and over again, we hear the exact same sentiments being reflected, which is that people saying we want to be able to run our own affairs, and we want to say over our own lives. And this is particularly, as someone who's a traditional owner from Central Australia, who has family who were impacted by the Northern Territory intervention and had to live under it, and were then impacted by the community development program. The right to have a say over their own lives up there is almost non-existent. Everything was controlled, from how they spent their money to what they did on a daily basis to everything else. I think that governments, time and time again over history, have failed to engage and to consult with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And that became significantly worse after the Howard government dismantled ATSIC, because at least within those frameworks we did have some sort of say and did have some sort of democratic choice. It didn't, but yeah, it's kind of the one thing that I would caution against. I think that there is a need for some sort of interim consultative group, consultation process, whatever else. But the one thing I would caution against is yet another Abbott's Indigenous Advisory Committee, where you've got a group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who a government handpicks in order to give feedback on various things, but they don't necessarily represent the community more broadly, because that same problem of not having a say in our own lives and not being properly represented just ends up being compounded over and over again. Yeah.
But there's a challenge, isn't there, in terms of reaching out to the stakeholders across Australia, because each state has got different communities.
Yes.
From within First Nations, and trying to find a way that, let's just take the state of Victoria, for example, trying to find a way of giving the First Nations communities within Victoria the ability to almost have like a state-based committee of some kind that then appoints people who then sit on a Commonwealth body in order to be able to send feedback up, take feedback back, so there's a continuous line of communication. It's not that easy to do.
No. No, it's not. And to be honest, I think it'll take a bit of time to get right. But that's also why I think that treaties are so incredibly crucial to the future of this country. Because if there's some sort of agreement reached, and if that happens at a clan-based, and we get bodies that, through those sorts of negotiations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people get some sort of say in how we're represented, how those bodies are constructed, and what responsibilities the governments have to us as First Peoples, then we have more of a chance of making sure that these bodies are reflective, are democratic, do represent these communities. Because as you say, Tom, we're dealing with over 200 First Nations groups across the country. There are a lot of us. But there are ways to ensure that the voices are heard from one coast to the other, if we get it right through a proper negotiated process.
And I'm mindful of the time. You've been generous with your time this afternoon. the interesting thing is you're standing in the election at a time when the Greens, particularly in Victoria, have made a specific point of putting up a Senate ticket that is completely Indigenous. How important is that?
It's so important. It's I've got the reason why I'm laughing a little bit, Tom, is my colleague Adam Frogley is on that Senate ticket. So Indigenous unionists represent. we're there, but one of the things with the Senate ticket is that three of the four people on it are traditional owners from Victoria, and that to me, is perfect. It makes sense. The idea that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are traditional owners within a particular state or territory can then go into the Senate and represent the entire state. It makes an awful lot of sense. But also, I never thought that I would see that option happen in Victoria ever. And yet here it is. We can actually see an all-Senate ticket made up of Indigenous people, and the diversity of those Indigenous people is extraordinary, like the various skills that they bring to the table, the age that they bring. It's really important. I never thought I'd see it, and it's, to be standing alongside that as someone who's running in a House of Representatives race is incredible. It is incredible.
What are the other, we've spoken a bit about some of the challenges in the First Nations space.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the other issues that push your buttons that you'll be wanting to grapple with?
Yeah. And we've spoken a bit about higher education too, so I won't go back over that. But that's a big ticket for me. Look, one of the benefits that I have as someone who has lived in this seat for such a long time is knowing that this is an incredibly diverse seat, that it's a multicultural seat, that, it has proud working class traditions, that there's a high migrant population, there's a high queer population, and the people in this seat care incredibly about the climate emergency and want the governments to act upon that in strong and decisive ways as quickly as possible. So things that stand out to me are definitely strong, decisive action on climate change, on land rejuvenation, on investments in sustainable energy technologies and energy efficiency technologies. The action on the climate emergency more broadly to ensure that future generations do have a future. Things like refugee rights. I'm a First Nations person. I've seen successive governments treat people who come to this country seeking asylum absolutely appallingly, denying them of all human rights and locking them up in detention centres for years on end. And it's I don't even have the words for how much it distresses and disgusts me that our country can treat people that way. So I want humane action in the spaces of refugee rights and asylum seekers. It's not illegal to seek asylum, and I would very much want to be, I want this country to change so that if people come here seeking asylum, that they're processed as quickly as possible and they are able to get on with their lives within our communities as quickly as possible as well. Not like what's been going on. Indigenous rights is always at the forefront. I'm trying to as a worker, as a unionist, the fact that most of us pay more tax than what the massive corporations do is extraordinary to me. So I want corporations taxed. I want billionaires and the incredibly wealthy taxed properly so that our social safety net is bolstered and we have things like mental and dental health covered by Medicare. We have more public housing out there. We can increase all of our pensions so that those who are on various pensions can actually live a proper life. The strengthening of our social safety net is crucial, particularly after COVID and seeing how many people in this electorate are struggling. We do have a lot of people that lost their jobs. We have a lot of artists, a lot of higher education workers and a lot of hospital workers in this area, and they lost their income during COVID. So social safety nets and bolstering those, to me, is just critical. Yeah.
In the best of worlds, we can put it that way, you end up walking through the doors of Parliament. Parliament has a curious culture. Question time is sort of the intellectual's equivalent of a UFC bout.
Yes.
What are the things that, if you could wave a wand in the air, what are the things about the culture of Parliament that you want to see change?
Well, I definitely want, this is so basic, but I want our representatives to be representative of the community. And they're not. Parliament is still dominated by white, straight men who are able-bodied, and Australia is significantly more diverse than that. We need more women in Parliament. We need more people of colour in Parliament. We definitely need more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Parliament. And, as you said, anyone who sat there and watched Question Time has just seen some appalling behaviours go on the floor when what we're actually debating, or what people are debating in those spaces, are the future of people in this country. I'm tired of this culture of it literally is one-upmanship and bullying, and the more that comes out about those bullying cultures within Parliament, the more urgent it is to actually address them and ensure that these are spaces where voices that represent our communities and are diverse enough to represent our communities can be heard. There is one controversial thing that I'm going to throw in the mix, Tom, and that is that, whilst many years ago, I did write an article for Eureka Street, and I highlighted the Section 44 debate and the fact that we got to a period in time where a lot of white parliamentarians were losing their seats in Parliament because they held dual citizenship. And, whilst it might have been funny to see people like Fraser Anning and a good old, what's his name? The National, sorry, I've COVID blanked there, lose their seats. whilst it might have been funny, that rule that dual citizens can't hold seats in Parliament was a hangover and is a hangover from the White Australia policy. It was installed in the Constitution to stop migrants of colour from anywhere bar New Zealand from running in Australian Parliament. And I think that needs to change. I think that, not only do we need to be more diverse, but we also need we need to change things so that we have, a more global outlook rather than such an insular little white Australian outlook. And changing that section of the Constitution to me is crucial in that.
We've covered a lot of ground. But you've been sort of very generous with your time. But people want to know more about you and the Greens and what's happening in the lead up to May the 21st when the election is held. Where do they go?
So if you want to know more about my campaign website is pretty simply Liddle, so liddle.greens.org.au. You can also find me on Facebook, so Celeste Liddle Greens on Facebook. And on Instagram, again under that handle. My Twitter presence is still my own. So as someone who's had a long media career, when I ran for the Greens, I said, no, I'm just keeping my Twitter account, and I can be, whilst I talk policy on it, I also just very much stay myself within that space. So if you want to see me in action, at Utopiana will get me on Twitter as well.
It'll get your dog on there too.
It'll get my dog as well. My dog Stella is a frequent guest appearer on my Twitter account.
Okay. I've been talking to Celeste Liddle. She's a candidate in the May 21 federal election for the Australian Greens in the seat at Cooper. Celeste, thank you so much for talking with me today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Tom.
Thank you.